My husband's mistress sat across from me at our family dinner, bragging about how she discovered this amazing little place and insisted we all come here. 20 minutes later, she realized she had been dining at my restaurant for months without knowing it. The soft amber lighting of Meridian Grille cast a warm glow across the mahogany tables, each one carefully set with crisp ivory linens and polished silverware that caught the light from the vintage chandeliers overhead. The gentle murmur of evening conversations blended with the subtle notes of jazz piano drifting from the corner, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that had taken me 3 years to perfect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stood near the entrance, adjusting the cuff of my navy blazer as I surveyed the dining room with quiet satisfaction. Every detail reflected my vision, from the exposed brick walls adorned with local artwork to the carefully curated wine collection displayed behind the mahogany bar. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was my sanctuary, built from the ground up after the darkest period of my life. The hostess, Ashley, approached with her usual warm smile. "Mrs. Harrison, your party's table is ready. Should I show them to the private dining room when they arrive?" I shook my head gently. "No, Ashley. The main dining room will be perfect tonight. Table 12, as we discussed." She nodded, understanding the subtle significance. Table 12 offered the perfect vantage point, central enough to be seen, intimate enough for family conversation, and positioned exactly where I could observe every interaction from my usual spot at the bar. Tonight wasn't just any family dinner. Tonight was the night I had been quietly preparing for since Robert's mother, Elise, had called 2 weeks ago. "Carla, dear," Elise had said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of affection and concern that only mothers-in-law could master. "I know things have been difficult between you and Robert lately, but Cooper's engagement is such a wonderful occasion. Couldn't we all try to come together?" As a family, Cooper, Robert's younger brother, had recently proposed to his longtime girlfriend Iera, and Elise was determined to host a celebration dinner. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Robert wouldn't be coming alone. The private investigator's photographs had made that abundantly clear. I had discovered Robert's affair 3 months ago, not through dramatic confrontation or tearful confessions, but through the mundane reality of credit card statements and unexplained absences. The woman's name was Ashley, not my hostess Ashley, but a different Ashley entirely. Ashley Chen, 28 years old, marketing coordinator at a downtown firm, and apparently someone who had very strong opinions about fine dining. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I had been pouring my heart, soul, and divorce settlement into creating Meridian Grille, while I had been working 16-hour days to establish something meaningful and lasting, Robert had been taking his mistress to restaurants across the city, including, as I would soon learn, my own. I moved to my usual position behind the bar, nodding to Marcus, our head bartender, who was polishing glasses with practiced precision. From here I could see everything, every entrance, every table, every subtle interaction that made the difference between a good evening and an unforgettable one. It was a skill I had developed over the past 2 years, this ability to observe and orchestrate without being obvious about it. The front door chimed, and I looked up to see Cooper entering with Iera, both of them radiating the kind of happiness that comes with new love and fresh possibilities. Cooper had always been the steadier of the two brothers, the one who thought before he spoke, who built relationships instead of burning them down. Tonight his face carried an extra glow of excitement as he guided Sierra toward the hostess station. "Aunt Carla," Kiera called out, spotting me behind the bar. She had been calling me that since she and Cooper started dating, a gesture of warmth that had always touched me deeply. "This place is incredible. I can't believe we've never been here before." I smiled, moving around the bar to greet them properly. "Welcome to Meridian Grille. I hope you'll find everything to your liking tonight." Cooper embraced me warmly, his eyes taking in the restaurant with genuine appreciation. "Carla, this is beautiful, really beautiful. You've created something special here." "Thank you," I replied, meaning it. Cooper's approval had always mattered to me, perhaps because he possessed the integrity his older brother seemed to have misplaced somewhere along the way. Elise arrived moments later, elegant as always in her charcoal wool coat and pearl earrings. At 62, she moved with the kind of refined grace that came from decades of social events and family gatherings. She had always been kind to me, even during the rocky periods of my marriage to Robert, and I genuinely regretted that tonight would likely complicate her carefully orchestrated family celebration. "Carla, darling," she said, kissing my cheek with practiced warmth. "Thank you for hosting us here. Cooper told me you owned a restaurant, but I had no idea it was something this sophisticated." "I'm glad you like it," I said, guiding them toward table 12. I wanted tonight to be special for Cooper and Sierra. As we settled into our seats, I caught Ashley's eye and gave her a subtle nod. Right on schedule, she appeared at our table with menus and water glasses, her professional demeanor betraying none of the conversation we had shared earlier about tonight's expected complications. "Can I start you with something from the bar?" Ashley asked, her voice carrying just the right note of attentive service. "Actually," Elise said, glancing around the room with obvious pleasure, "I think we should wait for Robert. He should be here any moment." Cooper checked his watch with a slight frown. "He's running late." That's not like him, but I knew exactly why Robert was running late. The private investigator's final report had been quite detailed about his subject's habits. Robert would arrive exactly 15 minutes behind schedule, because he would have spent that extra time in his car, coaching his companion on how to behave, what to say, how to present herself to his family. He would have chosen his words carefully, painting me as the distant, career-obsessed wife who had grown apart from the family, making his mother feel sympathy for his loneliness. What Robert didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 3 months not just uncovering his deception, but positioning myself for this exact moment. Every choice I had made since discovering the affair had been deliberate, calculated, and designed to ensure that when the truth finally emerged, it would do so on my terms, in my space, with my rules. The front door chimed again, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that always preceded moments of significant change. This was it. The performance was about to begin, and I was ready to take my place on the stage I had built myself. The familiar chime of the front door sent a ripple of awareness through my body, though I kept my expression carefully neutral as I reached for my water glass. From my peripheral vision, I could see Robert entering, his tall frame cutting a confident silhouette against the ambient lighting. He wore his charcoal suit, the one I had helped him pick out for his promotion last year, and that easy smile that had once made my heart skip, but now felt like a performance I'd seen too many times. But it wasn't Robert who commanded my attention. It was the woman beside him. She was striking in an obvious way, long auburn hair that caught the light perfectly, emerald green dress that hugged her figure just so, and the kind of confident stride that announced her presence to every person in the room. This had to be Ashley Chen, though seeing her in person was different from the surveillance photographs. In those images, she had looked younger, more uncertain. Tonight, she moved with the assurance of someone who believed she belonged here. "Sorry we're late," Robert called out as they approached our table, his voice carrying that familiar note of casual authority. Traffic was absolutely brutal coming from downtown. Elise's face brightened immediately. "Robert, darling." She stood to embrace her eldest son, and I watched the easy affection between them, a bond that would make tonight's revelations all the more painful for her. Cooper rose as well, extending his hand toward Robert with a warmth that spoke to their brotherly relationship, despite their differences. Good to see you, Rob. Though I have to say, 15 minutes late to celebrate my engagement. That's going to cost you." Robert laughed, the sound genuine and relaxed. "I'll make it up to you, I promise." Then, with what seemed like casual ease but felt utterly calculated, he turned toward his companion. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Ashley. Ashley, this is my family." The introduction hung in the air for a moment, deliberately vague about her role in his life. Not his friend, not his colleague, not his girlfriend, just Ashley. A masterclass in plausible deniability that probably worked well in most social situations. But this wasn't most social situations. Ashley stepped forward with a dazzling smile, her confidence immediately filling the space around our table. "It's such a pleasure to meet you all," she said, her voice warm and engaging. "Robert has told me so much about each of you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elise, ever the gracious hostess, took Ashley's hand warmly. "How lovely to meet you, dear, and what a wonderful choice for tonight's celebration." Oh, Ashley's eyes lit up with obvious delight. "Actually, this place was entirely my suggestion. I've been coming to Meridian Grille for months now. It's become my absolute favorite spot in the city." The moment Robert mentioned wanting to plan something special for Cooper's engagement, I knew we had to come here. She gestured around the restaurant with proprietary enthusiasm, as if she were personally responsible for its ambiance and success. "I've probably eaten here a dozen times over the past few months. The wine selection is incredible, and the chef is absolutely brilliant. I always sit at table 7 by the window, and Marcus, the bartender, knows exactly how I like my cosmos made." I felt Cooper glance toward me with a slight raise of his eyebrows, but I kept my expression carefully neutral, taking a slow sip of my water. This was better than I had imagined. Ashley wasn't just familiar with my restaurant, she was positioning herself as its unofficial ambassador, its most devoted patron. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. Robert shifted slightly, and I caught the brief tension in his shoulders. He hadn't expected Ashley to be quite so effusive about her connection to this place. Clearly, this level of detail about her dining habits here was news to him as well. "How wonderful," Elise said, settling back into her seat as Robert and Ashley joined us at the table. "It's always such a pleasure to dine at a place that's been personally recommended." Ashley beamed, clearly pleased with the positive reception. "Oh, you're going to love it. I've tried almost everything on the menu. The sea bass with lemon risotto is to die for, and if you're feeling adventurous, the duck confit will change your life." She was warming to her subject now, her voice taking on the animated quality of someone sharing a passionate interest. "I actually brought my book club here last month, 6 women, all very particular about their dining experiences, and every single one of them asked me for the name and number to make their own reservations." Cooper smiled politely. "It sounds like you've become quite the regular here." "Oh, absolutely," Ashley replied, reaching for her menu with the familiarity of someone who knew it by heart. "In fact, I was telling Robert just the other day that this place has ruined me for other restaurants. Once you've experienced this level of quality and service, everything else feels lesser." She paused. But Ashley wasn't ready to move on from her favorite topic. "You know what's funny?" she continued, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I actually work just 3 blocks from here, so I've gotten to know some of the regular lunch crowd. There's this group of businessmen who come in every Thursday, and Maria, she's one of the servers, always saves their favorite table." She was painting a picture of intimate familiarity with my restaurant, of being part of its daily rhythm and community. Every detail she shared drove home the reality that she had been living in my world without knowing it, forming relationships with my employees, occupying space in the sanctuary I had built with my own hands. Elise nodded approvingly. "It sounds like you've found a real gem here, Ashley. There's something special about a restaurant that feels like home." "Exactly," Ashley exclaimed, her enthusiasm reaching new heights. "That's exactly what this place is. It feels like home, like the owner understands that dining isn't just about food, it's about creating experiences, building community, making people feel valued and appreciated." She turned to look directly at me for the first time since arriving, her smile warm and inclusive. "I'm sorry, I don't think Robert properly introduced us. I'm Ashley Chen." I met her gaze evenly, my voice steady and calm. "I'm Carla Harrison." For just a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, a brief pause as if the name registered somewhere in her consciousness. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by that same bright enthusiasm. "It's wonderful to meet you, Carla. Are you looking forward to trying this place for the first time? I promise you won't be disappointed." I let Ashley's question hang in the air for just a moment, watching as she settled into her chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed she was among friends. The assumption that I was trying this place for the first time was so perfectly wrong that I had to admire the completeness of her misunderstanding. "I'm sure it will be enlightening," I replied, my tone neutral enough to satisfy her while carrying an undertone that made Robert shift uncomfortably in his seat. Ashley, however, was too caught up in her role as restaurant ambassador to notice the subtle tension. She opened her menu with the flourish of someone about to share a treasured secret. Since this is everyone's first time here, well, except for me, I absolutely have to recommend a few things. She leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice taking on the excited whisper of a true food enthusiast. The chef here has this incredible way with seasonal ingredients. Everything is sourced locally, and the menu changes just enough to keep things interesting without losing those signature dishes that keep people coming back. Sierra, bless her, seemed genuinely interested in Ashley's recommendations. That sounds wonderful. What would you suggest for someone who loves seafood? Oh, the pan-seared halibut is absolutely divine, Ashley responded immediately. It comes with this amazing saffron cream sauce that's unlike anything I've ever tasted. And the presentation, it's like artwork on a plate. I watched Robert's face as Ashley continued her enthusiastic review. He was trying to appear engaged, nodding at appropriate moments, but I could see the growing discomfort in his posture. This wasn't how he had planned for the evening to unfold. Ashley's intimate knowledge of the restaurant was clearly news to him, and her proprietary enthusiasm was drawing exactly the kind of attention he had probably hoped to avoid. Ashley certainly knows her way around the menu, Elise observed with an amused smile. How often did you say you dine here? At least twice a month, Ashley replied proudly. Sometimes more if I'm entertaining clients. This place has become my go-to for impressing people. She gestured around the dining room with obvious satisfaction. I've never brought anyone here who wasn't completely blown away. Cooper exchanged a quick glance with Sierra before asking, and you've never met the owner? In all those visits, Ashley shook her head, though her eyes sparkled with curiosity. No, but I hear she's fascinating. One of the servers mentioned that she actually designed the entire interior herself, and apparently she's very hands-on with the operations. Some nights she's here until closing, making sure everything runs perfectly. The accuracy of that information told me exactly which server had been sharing details about my work habits. Maria most likely, who had a tendency toward oversharing when she felt comfortable with regular customers. I made a mental note to have a gentle conversation with her about professional boundaries. That's quite impressive, Robert said, his voice carefully modulated. Running a restaurant is incredibly demanding work. Oh, absolutely, Ashley agreed, which is why I have such respect for her. I mean, to build something like this from the ground up, to create an atmosphere that feels both elegant and welcoming, that takes real vision. She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. You know, I've always wondered what inspired her to open this particular type of restaurant. The whole concept is so perfectly executed, like every detail was carefully considered. I could feel the irony building like pressure in my chest. Ashley was sitting across from me, praising my vision, my dedication, my attention to detail, while having absolutely no idea who she was talking to. Meanwhile, the man she was sleeping with, my husband, was growing more uncomfortable by the minute, as she inadvertently highlighted just how little he knew about the woman he was betraying me with. Perhaps, I said quietly, the owner was inspired by the idea of creating something that was entirely her own, something that couldn't be taken away or diminished by other people's choices. Ashley nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the underlying meaning of my words. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. There's something so empowering about building your own success, isn't there? About creating something that reflects who you really are. Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Ashley was too absorbed in her admiration for the restaurant to notice. She was also, I realized, revealing far more about herself than she probably intended. Her enthusiasm wasn't just about the food or the ambiance, it was about what this place represented to her. Success, sophistication, independence, all things she admired but hadn't achieved for herself. I actually follow the restaurant's social media, Ashley continued, pulling out her phone with the excitement of someone sharing a favorite discovery. The owner posts these beautiful photos of new dishes, behind-the-scenes glimpses of the kitchen. You can tell she's really passionate about what she does. She scrolled through her phone for a moment, before turning the screen toward the table. Look at this. She posted this just yesterday. It's the new autumn menu preview. I glanced at the image, my own photograph of the butternut squash soup with sage oil drizzle that I had posted from my personal account yesterday evening. The irony was so complete, it almost made me dizzy. Ashley was showing me my own work, praising my own creativity, while sitting across from me at a family dinner with the man who had been systematically betraying everything I had built. "That's lovely," Elise said, studying the photo with genuine appreciation. "She certainly has an eye for presentation, doesn't she?" Ashley beamed. "I've been following her posts for months now. Sometimes I even plan my visits around new menu items she features." She laughed, a sound that was genuinely warm and infectious. "I know it sounds silly, but I feel like I've gotten to know her personality through her posts. She seems like someone who really cares about creating meaningful experiences for people." The compliment hit me in an unexpected way. Despite everything, despite the affair, despite the betrayal, despite the elaborate deception that had brought us all to this table, Ashley's appreciation for my work felt genuine. She wasn't flattering an owner she hoped to impress. She was expressing real admiration for something I had created. It made what I was about to do both easier and more complicated. "Speaking of meaningful experiences," Robert interjected, clearly desperate to change the subject, "shouldn't we order some wine? We are here to celebrate Cooper and Sierra's engagement, after all." Ashley immediately brightened, her attention shifting back to her role as the evening's unofficial host. "Oh, you absolutely have to try their wine selection. The sommelier here is incredible. He can recommend something perfect for any occasion." She signaled to Marcus, who approached our table with the professional warmth that had made him one of my most valued employees. "Marcus, I was just telling everyone about your amazing wine recommendation." Marcus smiled politely, though I caught the brief flicker of confusion in his eyes, as he glanced between Ashley and me. He had seen us together at this table, had probably assumed we knew each other, and was now trying to navigate what seemed like an unusual social dynamic. "Good evening, everyone," he said smoothly. "Would you like me to suggest some pairings for tonight's celebration?" "Actually, Marcus," Ashley said, her voice taking on the familiar tone of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, "why don't you tell everyone about that amazing Bordeaux you recommended to me last week? The one from the small vineyard in St. Julien." Marcus's professional smile remained perfectly in place, though I caught the subtle glance he directed toward me. He was clearly trying to navigate the unusual dynamics at play, unsure why one of our regular customers was treating the owner's family dinner as her personal wine tasting event. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "The 2018 Chateau Ducros Beaucaillou. It's an exceptional vintage with notes of dark berries and a beautiful mineral finish, perfect for celebration." "See," Ashley beamed, turning to address the table, as if she had personally curated Marcus's expertise. "This is exactly what I mean about the level of service here. Marcus doesn't just pour wine, he creates experiences." I watched Robert's discomfort grow more pronounced as Ashley continued to position herself as the evening's unofficial hostess. His fingers drummed silently against the table, and I could see him calculating how to regain control of the situation without appearing rude to his family. "That sounds perfect," Elise said graciously. "Ashley, you certainly know how to pick a restaurant. This place feels very special." Ashley's chest swelled with obvious pride at the compliment. "Thank you, Elise. I have to admit, I take a lot of pride in my restaurant recommendations. Food and atmosphere are so important to me. I suppose you could say I have very high standards." The casual arrogance in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't just sharing her knowledge, she was establishing her superiority, her refined taste, her ability to recognize quality that others might miss. It was the same confidence I had seen in the private investigator's photographs, but now it was being directed at Robert's family, at me. "High standards are important," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough edge to make Robert shift in his seat, "especially when it comes to loyalty." Ashley nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the underlying meaning. "Exactly. That's why I keep coming back here. When you find something truly exceptional, you don't settle for less." Cooper cleared his throat gently, perhaps sensing the undercurrent of tension that seemed to be flowing beneath the surface conversation. "Speaking of exceptional things," he said, reaching for Kira's hand. "I think this is as good a time as any to share some of our wedding plans." Kira's face lit up immediately, and I felt a pang of genuine affection for the young couple. Their happiness was real, uncomplicated, and completely undeserving of the drama that was about to unfold around them. "We've set the date for next spring," Kira announced, her voice bright with excitement. "May 15th at the Botanical Gardens downtown." "How lovely," Ashley said, her tone warm but carrying a note of someone accustomed to being consulted on important matters. "Have you thought about your reception venue? Because I have to tell you, if you're looking for something truly memorable, you should consider having it here." The suggestion landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread outward from the point of impact. Robert's jaw tightened visibly, while Cooper and Kira exchanged uncertain glances. "That's thoughtful of you to suggest," Cooper said carefully. "But we haven't really started looking at reception venues yet." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her enthusiasm building. "Oh, but you should definitely consider it. The private dining room upstairs is absolutely gorgeous, and I know the owner would probably be willing to work with you on something special. I mean, for family." The word family hung in the air with a weight that made Robert close his eyes briefly. Ashley was overstepping, and everyone at the table could feel it, even if they couldn't quite articulate why. "Ashley," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that she seemed determined to ignore. "I'm just trying to help," she replied, her tone defensive but still bright. "Carla, you should see the upstairs space. It's like something out of a magazine, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city, and the most incredible chandelier." She turned back to Cooper and Chiara, her voice taking on the persuasive quality of someone making a sales pitch. "I've attended 3 private events here over the past few months, and each one was absolutely flawless. The attention to detail, the service, the presentation, everything was perfect. I found myself genuinely curious about these events Ashley claimed to have attended. My private dining room was booked months in advance, primarily for corporate functions and high-end celebrations. If Ashley had been a guest at 3 separate events, she was clearly moving in more influential circles than the private investigator's report had suggested. "That does sound beautiful," Elise said diplomatically, though I could see her trying to understand Ashley's role in making suggestions about her son's wedding reception. Ashley beamed at the positive response. "I could even put in a good word with the owner, if you'd like. I mean, I'm practically a member of the family here." She laughed at her own words, but the sound carried an edge of possessiveness that made my skin crawl. "A member of the family," I repeated slowly, letting the words settle. "That's an interesting way to put it." "Well, you know what I mean," Ashley said, waving her hand dismissively. "When you spend as much time somewhere as I do, when you develop relationships with the staff, when you really become invested in a place's success, it starts to feel like home." Robert's discomfort was now palpable. He was staring at Ashley with an expression I couldn't quite read, part frustration, part something that looked almost like fear. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew, the discreet companion who understood boundaries and knew when to step back. "Investment is crucial," I agreed, my tone conversational but pointed. "Especially when you're building something from nothing. It requires sacrifice, commitment, and above all, absolute honesty about what you're really contributing." Ashley nodded vigorously, still oblivious to the true meaning behind my words. "That's exactly what I admire about successful business owners. They don't take shortcuts, they don't rely on other people to build their dreams for them, and they certainly don't let anyone take advantage of their hard work." The irony was so complete it was almost breathtaking. Ashley was describing the very qualities that she was, unknowingly, violating by carrying on an affair with a married man whose wife had built the very establishment she was claiming to love and support. Marcus returned with the wine, and the ritual of tasting and approving provided a brief respite from the mounting tension. But I could see that Ashley wasn't finished. She had found her audience, had established her expertise, and was clearly preparing to cement her position as the evening's authority on all things related to Meridian Grille. "You know," she said, swirling her wineglass with practiced elegance, "I've been thinking about writing a review for this place. Something really comprehensive that captures not just the food and service, but the whole experience, the vision behind it. She looked around the table as if seeking approval for this grand gesture. I feel like I have such a unique perspective, having been a regular for so long, having really gotten to know the rhythm of this place. I think I could write something that would really do it justice. Cooper raised his eyebrows. That's quite an undertaking. Restaurant reviews can be pretty influential. Exactly, Ashley replied, her voice filled with the confidence of someone who believed her opinion carried significant weight, which is why I want to make sure I get it right. This place deserves recognition, and I think I'm the right person to give it the kind of thoughtful, detailed attention it deserves. The suggestion of writing a review hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Ashley feeding off what she perceived as the table's impressed silence. She clearly interpreted our lack of immediate response as awe at her generous offer to promote the restaurant. I've actually been developing quite a following on my food blog, Ashley continued, her voice gaining momentum as she warmed to her favorite subject, herself. Last month alone, I had over 3,000 unique visitors reading my recommendation. When I feature a restaurant, it makes a real difference. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling with practiced ease. Look at this, my review of that little bistro in the Arts District brought them so much business they had to start taking reservations 2 weeks in advance. Kira leaned forward politely to glance at the screen, ever the gracious listener. That's wonderful, Ashley. It must be nice to have that kind of influence. It's really about responsibility, Ashley replied, her tone taking on an almost professorial quality. When people trust your taste, when they rely on your recommendations, you have an obligation to maintain certain standards. I don't review just anywhere. I'm very selective about the establishments I choose to promote. I felt my jaw tighten at the implication that Meridian Grille should feel honored by her potential attention. The casual arrogance was breathtaking, especially coming from someone who had no idea she was speaking to the very person whose work she was offering to judge. Standards, I repeated softly. Yes, those are important, particularly when it comes to professional ethics. Ashley nodded vigorously, completely missing the pointed nature of my comment. Exactly. That's why I always do my research before I write anything. I get to know the staff. I understand the vision behind the concept. I really immerse myself in the experience. She gestured around the restaurant with proprietary confidence. Take this place, for example. I've been observing the operations for months now. I know which servers work which sections. I know how they handle busy nights. I've even noticed how they deal with difficult customers. Robert's wine glass froze halfway to his lips, and I could see the exact moment he realized Ashley was positioning herself as far more than just an occasional diner. She was presenting herself as an expert observer, someone with insider knowledge and professional authority. That level of observation must take considerable time and dedication, Elise said carefully, though I caught the slight uncertainty in her voice. Oh, it does, Ashley agreed enthusiastically. But that's what separates a real review from just another online opinion. Anyone can eat a meal and write a paragraph. What I do is provide comprehensive analysis, atmosphere, service consistency, menu innovation, value proposition. She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying having the table's attention. For instance, I've noticed that this restaurant maintains the same level of excellence, whether you're dining on a quiet Tuesday night or during the peak weekend rush. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It speaks to exceptional management and training. The compliment should have pleased me, but instead it felt like someone else taking credit for my work, analyzing my efforts as if they were academic exercises, rather than the result of countless 18-hour days and personal sacrifice. Exceptional management, Cooper repeated thoughtfully. That does sound like something worth recognizing. Ashley beamed at his apparent agreement. Right, and that's exactly why I want to write something really substantial about this place, something that will bring it the recognition it deserves. She leaned back in her chair with obvious satisfaction. I'm thinking a 3-part series: atmosphere and concept, culinary excellence and service philosophy. The audacity was stunning. She was sitting at my table planning to write about my restaurant as if it were her discovery, her project, her generous gift to the culinary world. 3 parts, I said. my voice carefully controlled. That seems extensive. Well, exceptional places deserve exceptional coverage, Ashley replied, clearly pleased with her own magnanimity. I don't do this for just anyone, you understand. But this restaurant, this owner, she deserves to have her story told properly. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out slightly strained. Ashley, maybe we should focus on, actually, Ashley interrupted, her enthusiasm building to new heights. I've been thinking about trying to arrange an interview with the owner. You know, really get into the inspiration behind the concept, the challenges of running a high-end establishment, her vision for the future. She turned to Marcus, who had been standing patiently nearby with our wine selection. Marcus, do you think the owner might be open to that kind of feature piece? I mean, given how much I've supported this place, and considering the platform I could offer her. Marcus's eyes darted toward me with unmistakable panic. He was being asked to speak for me, about me, to someone who clearly had no idea who she was actually addressing. I gave him the slightest shake of my head, and I watched his shoulders relax slightly. The owner is quite private, he said, diplomatically. She prefers to let the restaurant speak for itself. Ashley's expression flickered with what looked like disappointment, but she quickly recovered. Well, that's understandable, I suppose. Successful people are often protective of their privacy. She brightened again almost immediately. But that just makes it more important for people like me to ensure her work gets the recognition it deserves, doesn't it? The presumption was staggering. Ashley had appointed herself as my advocate, my promoter, my voice to the world, all while carrying on an affair with my husband, and sitting at my family table, as if she belonged there. Recognition, I said quietly, can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes the people who claim to support you are the ones who end up causing the most damage. Ashley's eyebrows drew together slightly at my comment about recognition and damage, but before she could respond, our conversation was interrupted by the soft approach of footsteps. I looked up to see James, my assistant manager, walking toward our table with the kind of purposeful stride that meant something required my immediate attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the respectful tone he always used when addressing me in front of guests. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but we have a situation with the private dining reservation upstairs. The client is requesting some modifications to tomorrow's event setup, and they're quite insistent about speaking with you personally." The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water. I watched as Ashley's confident expression began to shift, confusion flickering across her features as she processed what James had just said. Mrs. Harrison, the name that Marcus had called me when I first arrived, the name that was printed on business cards in the office upstairs, the name that appeared on the restaurant's incorporation documents. "Of course," I replied calmly, setting my napkin beside my plate. "Tell them I'll be up in just a moment to discuss the details." James nodded and retreated, but the damage was already done. Ashley's face had gone pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, as the implications began to sink in. Across the table, Robert had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on me with an expression of dawning horror. "I'm sorry," Ashley said slowly, her voice noticeably smaller than it had been moments before. "Did he just call you Mrs. Harrison?" I met her gaze steadily, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough for the full weight of realization to settle. "Yes, he did." "But, Harrison." Ashley's voice trailed off as she glanced desperately toward Robert, seeking some explanation, some way to make sense of what she was hearing. "Robert, your last name is Harrison." "Yes," I said quietly, answering for my husband who seemed to have lost the ability to speak. "It is." The pieces were falling into place now, and I could see Ashley's mind working frantically to reorganize everything she thought she knew about this evening, about this restaurant, about the woman sitting across from her, who had been listening to her enthusiastic praise and casual presumptions for the past hour. Ashley started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "You're Robert's wife," I finished for her, my voice remaining perfectly calm. "Yes, and more relevantly to tonight's conversation, I'm also the owner of Meridian Grille." The effect was immediate and devastating. Ashley's confident posture crumbled, her shoulders sagging as if someone had suddenly removed all the air from her lungs. The wine glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, though she managed to catch it before it shattered against the table. A few drops of red wine splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, creating dark stains that seemed to spread in slow motion. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words barely audible. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving us suspended in a bubble of shock and mortification. Elise's face had gone white with understanding, while Cooper and Sierra sat frozen, their engagement celebration forgotten in the face of this devastating revelation. Ashley's hands began to tremble visibly. For the past hour, she had been regaling the table with stories of her expertise, her insider knowledge, her special relationship with this establishment. She had positioned herself as the restaurant's unofficial ambassador, someone whose opinion carried weight, whose recommendations mattered. She had even suggested writing a comprehensive review series and interviewing the owner. The owner who had been sitting directly across from her the entire time. "All those things you said," Ashley whispered, her voice barely a breath. "About the owner, about the restaurant, about your special relationship with this place," I supplied gently. "About how you're practically family here. About how you've been observing my operations for months." Each word was like a physical blow, and I watched Ashley flinch with every phrase. The casual arrogance that had defined her entire demeanor was gone, replaced by the dawning realization of just how completely she had humiliated herself. "I didn't know," she said desperately, looking around the table as if seeking someone who might offer her a lifeline. "Robert never told me that this was mine," I asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's interesting. I wonder what else Robert hasn't told you." Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Carla, please." "Please what?" I asked, turning my attention to my husband for the first time since the revelation. "Please don't mention that you've been bringing your mistress to dine at my restaurant for months. Please don't point out that she's been unknowingly giving me money while she's been sleeping with my husband." Ashley made a small sound that might have been a sob, her face now completely drained of color. The magnitude of her situation was becoming clear. Not only had she been caught in an affair with a married man, but she had spent the evening making a fool of herself in front of his wife, bragging about her connection to a business that belonged to the very woman she had been betraying. "I need to go," Ashley said suddenly, starting to rise from her chair on unsteady legs. "I can't, I need to leave." "Actually," I said calmly, "I think you should stay. After all, you were so enthusiastic about experiencing everything this restaurant has to offer. It would be a shame for you to miss the rest of the evening." Ashley sank back into her chair, as if my words had physically pushed her down. The suggestion that she stay for the rest of the evening seemed to paralyze her completely. Her face had taken on an ashen quality that made her makeup appear garish in contrast, and her hands continued to shake as she gripped the edge of the table. "Carla," Robert said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "this isn't the time or place for what?" I interrupted smoothly, turning my full attention to my husband for the first time that evening. "For honesty, for clarity, I think this is exactly the right time and place, don't you?" The dining room around us continued its elegant rhythm, the soft clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the gentle jazz piano in the corner. But at our table, time seemed suspended in a bubble of devastating revelation. I could see other diners occasionally glancing in our direction, drawn by the palpable tension that radiated from our small group. Elise, who had been sitting in stunned silence since the revelation, finally found her voice. "Carla, dear," she said carefully, her years of social grace kicking in despite the circumstances, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Actually, Elise," I replied, my tone remaining perfectly calm, "I think transparency is exactly what this situation needs. After all, Ashley has been so enthusiastic about sharing her opinions with all of us. I'd hate for her to feel excluded from the conversation now." Ashley flinched at the mention of her name, her eyes darting desperately between Robert and the exit. "I really should go," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. "But you haven't even ordered yet," I pointed out, gesturing to the untouched menu in front of her. And you were so excited to share your recommendations with everyone. Surely you'd like to experience the full dining experience you've been praising so highly. Cooper, who had been watching the unfolding drama with growing horror, finally spoke up. Carla, maybe we should. Cooper, I said gently, my voice softening as I addressed my brother-in-law. I'm sorry this is happening during your celebration, but I think it's important that everyone understands exactly what's been going on. Chiara reached for Cooper's hand, her face pale but determined. What does this mean? She asked quietly. Ashley let out a sound that was half sob, half bitter laugh. It means, she said, her voice hollow, that I've been having an affair with a married man, and I've spent the last hour making a complete fool of myself in front of his wife. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I saw Robert's face contort with a mixture of anger and desperation. He was losing control of the narrative, and we both knew it. Ashley, stop, he said sharply, his voice carrying an edge I recognized from our worst arguments. You don't need to. Don't I? Ashley turned to look at him directly for the first time since the revelation, and I was struck by the transformation in her face. The confident, self-assured woman who had walked in beside him was gone, replaced by someone who looked utterly lost. Don't I need to acknowledge what I've done, what we've done? She looked around the table, her gaze finally settling on me. I've been coming to your restaurant for months, she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears began to well in her eyes. I've been giving you my money, praising your work, building relationships with your staff, all while sleeping with your husband. The confession was brutal in its honesty, and I found myself studying Ashley's face for signs of calculation or manipulation. But what I saw instead was genuine anguish, the kind of raw emotion that couldn't be faked. Yes, I said simply. You have. I didn't know, Ashley continued, her voice breaking slightly. I swear to you, I didn't know this was your place. Robert never told me about any of this. She gestured around the restaurant with a trembling hand. When I said I wanted to meet the owner, when I talked about writing that review, when I said I felt like family here, I had no idea I was talking to. She couldn't finish the sentence. To the woman whose husband you've been fucking, I supplied quietly. The crude word landed like a slap, causing Elise to gasp audibly, and Cooper to close his eyes in dismay. But Ashley didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded slowly. Yes, she whispered. I had no idea. Robert's face had gone red with fury and embarrassment. For God's sake, Carla, there are other people here. Yes, there are, I agreed, looking around the table at the faces of his family members. There's your mother, who welcomed Ashley warmly because she thought she was just a friend. There's your brother and his fiancé, who were expecting a nice celebration dinner. And there's me, your wife, who's been listening to your mistress lecture me about my own restaurant for the past hour. Ashley buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The question now, I continued, my voice remaining steady and controlled, is what we do next. The question of what to do next settled over the table like a weight, and I could see each person processing the implications differently. Robert's face had taken on a mottled red color that extended down his neck, a telltale sign of the rage and panic he was struggling to contain. Ashley remained hunched over, her face still buried in her hands, but I could tell she was listening intently to every word. I think, I said slowly, deliberately, that we should order dinner. After all, Ashley was so insistent that everyone experience what this restaurant has to offer. The suggestion was met with stunned silence. Cooper's mouth opened slightly, as if he were about to protest, but no words came out. Ciara's grip on his hand had tightened visibly, her knuckles white against the tablecloth. Carla, Elise said carefully, her voice carrying the tone of someone trying to defuse a dangerous situation. Perhaps this isn't the best time to. On the contrary, I interrupted gently, I think this is the perfect time. Ashley has been coming here for months, building what she calls a special relationship with this place. She's observed my operations, analyzed my service, praised my menu. Surely she'd want to experience the full dining experience she's been so enthusiastic about sharing with others. I turned my attention to Ashley, who had finally lifted her head to look at me with red-rimmed eyes. After all, you were planning to write that comprehensive review series, weren't you? The three-part analysis of atmosphere, culinary excellence, and service philosophy. Ashley's face crumpled at the reminder of her earlier boasting. Please, she whispered. I can't, I just want to leave. But that would be such a waste, I continued, my voice remaining perfectly calm and reasonable. You've invested so much time in getting to know this place, in building relationships with my staff. Marcus knows exactly how you like your cosmos made, isn't that right, Marcus? Marcus, who had been standing nearby with obvious discomfort, nodded reluctantly. Yes, ma'am. 3 parts vodka, 1 part cranberry juice, fresh lime juice, and a sugar rim. See? I smiled at Ashley, who looked as if she might be physically ill. That's the kind of personalized service you were praising earlier. The attention to detail that makes a restaurant truly special. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out strained and desperate. Carla, stop this. You're making a scene, am I? I looked around the dining room, where other patrons continued their meals in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding at our table. I think you'll find that the only scene being made is the one created by your decision to bring your mistress to my restaurant and let her lecture me about my own business. The word mistress hit Ashley like a physical blow, and she flinched visibly. It was a harsh term, clinical and unforgiving, and it stripped away any romantic notions she might have had about her relationship with Robert. I should order for the table, I continued, signaling to one of my servers. Since Ashley is clearly too upset to make decisions right now, and Robert seems to have lost his appetite for, well, for most things, I imagine. Maria approached our table with professional composure, though I could see the concern in her eyes. She had obviously noticed the tension, but was too well trained to let it show in her demeanor. Good evening, Mrs. Harrison, she said smoothly. Are you ready to order? The use of my title and last name was like another small bomb going off at the table. Ashley's eyes widened as she heard it again, the reality of my identity hitting her anew. She was in my restaurant, being served by my employees, sitting at my table while having an affair with my husband. Yes, Maria, I replied pleasantly. I think we'll start with the seafood tower for the table, and perhaps a bottle of the Montrachet, the 2019 vintage. Excellent choice, Maria replied, though her eyes flicked nervously around the table, clearly sensing the undercurrents of tension. Oh, and Maria, I added casually, I believe you know Miss Chen here. She's been a regular customer for several months. Maria's face brightened with genuine recognition. Of course, Miss Chen. It's lovely to see you again. Your usual table by the window wasn't available tonight, but I hope you're enjoying the change of scenery. Ashley's face went from pale to green. Even the server knew her dining habits, her preferences, her regular routine. The web of irony was complete. She had been a valued customer at my restaurant while betraying me with my husband. Thank you, Maria, I said smoothly. Miss Chen was just telling us how much she enjoys the personalized service here, how she feels like part of the family. Maria beamed, clearly pleased to hear positive feedback about her service. That's wonderful to hear. We do try to make all our regular guests feel welcomed and appreciated. I'm sure you do, I replied, my smile never wavering. Miss Chen was also mentioning that she's been considering writing a review of the restaurant, something comprehensive and detailed. Oh, how exciting, Maria exclaimed, turning to Ashley with genuine enthusiasm. We'd be honored to have your endorsement, Mrs. Harrison has worked so hard to make this place special. Ashley looked as if she might faint. Here was Maria, innocently highlighting the very irony that was destroying her, that she had been unknowingly praising the work of the woman whose marriage she was helping to destroy. I'm sure Ashley managed to whisper that Mrs. Harrison has worked very hard indeed. The emphasis on my title wasn't lost on anyone at the table. It was Ashley's first acknowledgement of who I really was, and it carried the weight of everything she was beginning to understand about her situation. Yes, I agreed pleasantly. I have. Building something from the ground up requires tremendous dedication. You have to be willing to sacrifice, to put everything on the line, to trust that the people in your life will support your dreams rather than undermine them. The message was clear, and Ashley received it like a physical blow. Her face crumpled again, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if trying to hold back a sob. "I think," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm going to be sick." Ashley's declaration that she was going to be sick seemed to snap something into focus for everyone at the table. The theoretical nature of the confrontation suddenly became very real, very physical, and very immediate. "The restrooms are just past the bar," I said calmly, pointing toward the back of the restaurant. "Maria can show you the way if you need assistance." Ashley pushed back from the table with jerky, unsteady movements, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made several nearby diners look up from their meals. She stumbled slightly as she stood, one hand pressed against her stomach, the other gripping the back of her chair for support. I'll be right back," she managed to say, though her voice was barely audible. "Of course," I replied pleasantly. "Take your time. The evening is still young." As Ashley made her way toward the restrooms, moving with the careful steps of someone trying very hard not to collapse, I turned my attention back to the table. Robert was staring after her with an expression I couldn't quite read, part concern, part irritation, part something that looked almost like calculation. "Well," I said, smoothing my napkin across my lap, "that was dramatic. But I suppose these things often are." Elise's face was a mask of controlled shock. "Carla dear, I think perhaps we should what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Should pretend this isn't happening. Should act as if everything is normal." "I'm afraid that ship has sailed, Elise." Cooper cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Look, Carla, I'm sorry this is happening, but maybe we could discuss this somewhere more private." "Actually," I said, taking a sip of my water, "I think this is exactly the right place to discuss it. After all, this is where it's been happening for months. Ashley has been coming here, enjoying meals that I've carefully crafted, building relationships with staff that I've trained, all while carrying on an affair with my husband." I gestured around the dining room, with the same proprietary confidence that Ashley had displayed earlier. "Every table she's sat at, every meal she's ordered, every conversation she's had with my employees, it's all been happening under my roof, with my resources, funded by my work." Robert's jaw tightened. "Carla, you're making this sound more calculated than it was. These things just happen, do they?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like there were quite a few deliberate choices involved. The choice to start an affair, the choice to bring her here, the choice to let her become a regular customer, while keeping her completely in the dark about who actually owns this place." The accusation hung in the air, and I could see Robert struggling to find a response that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. "You never told her," Cooper said slowly, realization dawning on his face. "You never told Ashley that Carla owns this restaurant. Why would I?" Robert replied defensively, "It wasn't relevant." I interrupted, my voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge that made everyone at the table sit up straighter. "Your wife's business wasn't relevant to your relationship with another woman. The restaurant where you were conducting your affair wasn't relevant." The truth was starting to emerge, and it was even more damaging than I had expected. Robert hadn't just been careless about keeping Ashley in the dark, he had been deliberately deceptive. He had allowed her to fall in love with my restaurant, to build a relationship with my staff, to invest emotionally in the place I had created, all while knowing that she was unknowingly supporting the very woman she was betraying. "My God," Elise whispered, her hand pressed to her throat. "Robert, how could you?" "It's not what you think," Robert said quickly, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling. "I never meant for things to get this complicated." "Complicated," I repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I suppose bringing your mistress to your wife's restaurant for months, while letting her believe she's some kind of culinary expert, would qualify as complicated." Just then, Ashley returned from the restroom, moving slowly and carefully. Her face was pale but composed, as if she had used the privacy to gather herself together. She had clearly splashed water on her face and reapplied her lipstick, but the damage to her confidence was irreparable. "I apologize," she said quietly as she took her seat. "I needed a moment to process everything." "Of course," I replied graciously. These revelations can be overwhelming. But I'm glad you're feeling better, because I think we have quite a bit more to discuss. Ashley's eyes darted toward Robert, then back to me. I understand if you want me to leave. I understand if you never want to see me again. But I need you to know that I genuinely had no idea. About the restaurant? I asked. About any of it, Ashley replied, her voice gaining strength. Robert told me he was separated. He said you were living apart, that the divorce was already in progress. He said you had your own life, your own interests. The lies tumbled out one after another, each one more damaging than the last. I watched Robert's face grow increasingly red as Ashley unknowingly exposed the elaborate deception he had constructed to justify his affair. Separated, I repeated thoughtfully. How interesting. And when did this separation supposedly begin? Ashley's face crumpled as she realized she was revealing information that contradicted everything Robert had told her. He said it started about 6 months ago, when you became so focused on your work that you didn't have time for the marriage anymore. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. 6 months ago, that would be right around the time I opened this restaurant, wouldn't it? The timing of Robert's supposed separation story landed with devastating precision. I watched as the full implications dawned on Ashley's face, the color draining from her cheeks as she realized how perfectly she had been manipulated. 6 months ago, exactly when I had been working 18-hour days to launch Meridian Grille, when I had been pouring everything I had into making my dream a reality. 6 months, I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air. So according to Robert, I was so consumed with opening this restaurant that I abandoned my marriage. How convenient. Robert's face had gone from red to a mottled purple, and I could see the vein in his temple throbbing with the effort of containing his rage. Carla, you're twisting, am I? I interrupted, my voice remaining perfectly calm despite the fury building inside me, because it seems to me that the timeline is quite clear. I was building something meaningful, something lasting, and you were telling another woman that my dedication to my work was proof that our marriage was over. Ashley's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, nearly knocking it over in the process. He said you had become a different person. That success had changed you, made you cold and distant. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I smiled, not the practiced professional smile I wore for difficult customers, but something colder, more calculating. Success, I said thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose I have been successful. This restaurant has exceeded every projection, every dream I had when I first conceived it. We're booked solid for the next 3 months, we've been featured in every major food publication in the city, and we've built a loyal customer base that includes, apparently, my husband's mistress. I gestured around the dining room, where the evening crowd continued their meals in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding at our table. So yes, Ashley, I have been successful, and if that success made me seem different to Robert, perhaps it's because I finally understood what I was capable of when I stopped waiting for his support and started building something entirely my own. The words carried a finality that seemed to settle over the table like a shroud. Even Cooper, who had been trying to find ways to mediate the situation, fell silent as he processed the full scope of what had been happening. I think, I continued, standing gracefully from my chair, that this evening has been quite educational for everyone involved. Ashley, you've learned that the restaurant you've been praising so highly belongs to the woman whose marriage you've been helping to destroy. Robert, you've learned that bringing your mistress to your wife's business was perhaps not the most strategic choice you've ever made. I picked up my purse, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both dismissal and authority, and I've learned that my husband is not only a liar and a cheat, but he's also remarkably poor at managing his deceptions. Ashley looked up at me with desperate eyes. Mrs. Harrison, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I never would have, if I had known. If you had known what? I asked, genuinely curious. Would you have ended the affair? Would you have refused to come here, or would you have simply been more careful about hiding it? The question hung in the air, and I could see Ashley struggling to find an answer that wouldn't make her look I looked at Robert, who had remained silent throughout my final speech, his face a mask of barely contained fury and humiliation. "You can finish your meal or leave this entirely up to you. But either way, you'll be receiving a bill for tonight's dinner. I don't provide free meals to people who've been systematically betraying me." The practical nature of the statement, the casual mention of payment in the midst of such emotional devastation, seemed to hit Ashley particularly hard. She let out a small sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, and I realized she was finally understanding the full scope of the irony. She had been paying for the privilege of dining at my restaurant while having an affair with my husband. "The seafood tower and wine you ordered will be out shortly," added, maintaining my professional demeanor to the very end. "I do hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." With that, I turned and walked away from the table, my heels clicking against the polished floor with steady, confident steps. I didn't look back, didn't hesitate, didn't allow myself to show even the slightest hint of the emotional turmoil churning beneath my composed exterior. Behind me, I could hear the stunned silence of the table I had just left, punctuated only by the normal sounds of the restaurant continuing its evening service. Other diners laughed and chatted, unaware that they had just witnessed the precise, calculated destruction of two people who had believed they held all the power in our twisted triangle. As I made my way toward the kitchen to check on the evening's service, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of completion, of balance restored. The scales had finally tipped in my favor, and it felt exactly as satisfying as I had hoped it would. I made my way to the kitchen, where the familiar sounds of dinner service provided a stark contrast to the emotional devastation I had just left behind. The rhythmic chopping of knives, the sizzle of pans, the coordinated ballet of my kitchen staff, it all felt remarkably normal after the surreal confrontation at table 12. "Mrs. Harrison," Chef Laurent called out as I entered, his French accent cutting through the kitchen noise. "The seafood tower for table 12 is ready." But Maria mentioned there seemed to be some tension at the table. I paused, considering how to respond. My staff had always been protective of me, and I knew that word of tonight's drama would spread quickly through the tight-knit community of the restaurant. Better to control the narrative from the beginning. "There's been a family situation," I said carefully, watching as Laurent's eyebrows rose with concern. "Nothing that affects the service, but I wanted you to know that table 12 may not be staying for the full meal." Laurent nodded, his professional demeanor never wavering. "Understood. Should we hold the remaining courses?" "No," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "If they choose to stay, they'll receive exactly the same level of service as any other customer. If they choose to leave, that's their decision." The message was clear: there would be no special treatment, no accommodations, no recognition of the personal drama that had just unfolded. In my restaurant, everyone was held to the same standards, regardless of their relationship to me. I moved to the small office adjacent to the kitchen, where I kept a monitor that showed feeds from the dining room security cameras. It felt voyeuristic, but I found myself unable to resist checking on the aftermath of my departure. The scene at table 12 was exactly what I had expected. Ashley sat hunched over, her face buried in her hands, while Robert stared at his wine glass with the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed. Cooper and Kira were leaning toward each other, engaged in what appeared to be urgent whispered conversation, while Elise sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of controlled fury. As I watched Maria approach the table with the seafood tower, her professional smile firmly in place despite the obvious tension. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see her gesturing toward the elaborate display of oysters, crab, and lobster that represented hours of careful preparation by my kitchen staff. Ashley looked up at the tower with an expression of such profound misery that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Here was the dish she had probably recommended to countless friends and clients, the centerpiece of her favorite restaurant, now serving as a monument to her own humiliation. Robert said something to Maria. I could see his lips moving, his hand gesturing dismissively toward the food. Maria's posture stiffened slightly, and I felt a flash of anger at the thought of him taking his frustration out on my staff. I was halfway to the door, ready to intervene, when I saw Cooper place a firm hand on Robert's arm. Whatever he said caused Robert to sit back in his chair, his face flushing with embarrassment. Cooper then turned to Maria with what appeared to be an apology, and I watched as her professional smile returned. Good. Cooper had always been the reasonable one, the brother who understood that other people's mistakes didn't give you license to treat service staff poorly. It was one of the reasons I had always liked him, and why I genuinely regretted that his engagement celebration had been ruined by tonight's revelations. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see a notification from my assistant manager, James. Mrs. Harrison, there's been a request to move the private dining party upstairs to tomorrow night. The client is offering to pay a premium for the short notice. Should I accept? I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, accept the premium and confirm the new date. Tonight's private dining room should remain available for any last-minute bookings. It was a business decision, nothing more. But as I sent the message, I realized I was already thinking beyond tonight's drama, already planning for a future that no longer included Robert as a central figure in my life. Another glance at the monitor showed that the dynamics at table 12 had shifted again. Ashley was now sitting up straighter, her posture suggesting she had made some kind of decision. She was speaking to Robert with apparent intensity, her hands moving in sharp gestures that conveyed frustration or anger. Robert's face was a study in discomfort as he listened to whatever Ashley was saying. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting around the restaurant as if looking for an escape route. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely powerless. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, Robert had been the one controlling the narrative, managing both his wife and his mistress with carefully crafted lies and strategic omissions. Now, in the space of a single evening, that control had been stripped away, leaving him to face the consequences of his deceptions. I turned away from the monitor, no longer interested in watching the aftermath of my calculated revenge. There was work to be done, a restaurant to run, and a life to rebuild. Tonight had been about settling scores and restoring balance. Tomorrow would be about moving forward. As I prepared to return to the dining room to check on the evening service, I caught sight of my reflection in the office window. The woman looking back at me was composed, professional, and completely in control. She bore little resemblance to the wife who had discovered her husband's affair 3 months ago, or even to the woman who had sat down at table 12 earlier this evening. This was who I was now, the owner of a successful restaurant, a woman who had built something meaningful from nothing, someone who refused to be diminished by other people's choices. It was a transformation that felt both natural and profound, like finally stepping into a role I had been preparing for my entire life. When I returned to the dining room 40 minutes later, I was surprised to find that table 12 was still occupied. The seafood tower remained largely untouched, its carefully arranged display of oysters and crab now serving as a monument to the evening's devastation. The expensive wine I had ordered sat barely touched, its deep burgundy color seeming to mock the ruins of what should have been a celebration. But the most striking change was in the seating arrangement. Ashley had moved her chair slightly away from Robert, creating a physical distance that spoke volumes about the shift in their relationship. Her posture was different too, no longer the confident, gregarious woman who had walked in beside him, but someone who looked as if she were bracing herself for impact. As I approached nearby tables, checking on other guests with my usual professional demeanor, I couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation taking place at table 12. Ashley's voice carried an edge of desperation that hadn't been there before. 6 months of lies, Robert. 6 months of thinking I was helping you through a difficult divorce, when really I was just the other woman in some sick game. Robert's response was too quiet for me to hear, but I could see his hands gesturing defensively, his body language speaking to someone who was rapidly losing control of a situation he had once managed with ease. You let me come here, Ashley continued, her voice gaining strength. You let me fall in love with this place, build relationships with the staff, become a regular customer. You watched me make a fool of myself praising your wife's work, and you said nothing. The accusation was devastating in its accuracy. Robert had orchestrated a situation where his mistress was unknowingly supporting his wife's business, while believing herself to be involved in a justified relationship with a separated man. The psychological cruelty of it was breathtaking. I moved to a table within closer earshot, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement, while listening to the conversation that was determining the future of two people who had thought they held all the power in our triangle. I never meant for it to get this complicated. Robert was saying, his voice carrying the whine of someone who had been caught in a lie, and was now trying to minimize the damage. I was going to tell you eventually, when the time was right. When would that have been? Ashley shot back, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. When you finally got around to actually divorcing your wife. When you told her about us, or were you planning to just let me keep coming here, keep giving money to the woman I was betraying, indefinitely? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and I could see Robert struggling to find answers that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. You don't understand the pressure I was under, he said finally, his voice taking on a defensive tone. Carla was so focused on this restaurant, so obsessed with making it successful. She didn't have time for anything else, including our marriage. So you decided to start an affair instead of talking to her about it. Ashley's voice was incredulous. You thought the solution to your wife being busy with her career was to bring your mistress to the restaurant she was working so hard to build. The logic was inescapable, and I watched Robert's face crumple as he realized there was no way to spin his actions into something defensible. He had been caught not just in adultery, but in a level of callous manipulation that spoke to something fundamentally broken in his character. I care about you, Robert said desperately, reaching across the table to take Ashley's hand. What we have is real, regardless of how it started. Ashley pulled her hand away as if she had been burned. Is it? Because I'm starting to wonder if anything you've told me has been real. You lied about being separated, you lied about your wife not caring about the marriage, you lied about why you couldn't be seen together in public. What else have you been lying about? The question seemed to deflate Robert completely, his shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely defeated. The confident, charismatic man who had once swept me off my feet was gone, replaced by someone who looked small and pathetic. I never lied about my feelings for you, he said quietly, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Didn't you? Ashley asked, her voice now carrying a note of bitter amusement. Because if you really cared about me, you would have been honest with me from the beginning. You would have told me about this restaurant, about your wife's success, about the fact that I was unknowingly funding the life of the woman I was helping you betray. She stood up from the table, her movements sharp and decisive. I need to go home. I need to think about what this means, what I've been a part of. Ashley, please. Robert started to stand as well, but she held up a hand to stop him. No, I need time to process this, to figure out who I am when I'm not living in a fantasy you created for me. She looked around the restaurant one final time, her gaze taking in the elegant decor, the attentive staff, the carefully curated atmosphere that had made her feel so sophisticated and worldly. Now it all served as a reminder of her own gullibility, her willingness to believe a story that had been crafted to serve someone else's selfish purposes. I'm sorry, she said quietly, though it was unclear whether she was speaking to Robert or to the restaurant itself. I'm sorry for all of it. Ashley gathered her purse with trembling hands, her movements deliberate but unsteady. I watched from my position near the bar as she prepared to leave, noting how different she looked from the confident woman who had walked in earlier that evening. The emerald dress that had seemed so sophisticated now appeared almost garish against her pale complexion, and her carefully styled hair had begun to come undone from the stress of the evening. Ashley, wait, Robert called out, his voice carrying a note of desperation that I had never heard before. You can't just leave like this. We need to talk about what happens next. She turned to face him, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her features, not love, not even affection, but something that looked almost like pity. What happens next? She repeated, her voice hollow. What happens next is that I go home and try to figure out how I became the kind of person who could spend months unknowingly supporting the wife of the man I was sleeping with. The words hit Robert like physical blows, and I watched him flinch with each accusation. He had built his entire deception on the assumption that he could control both women in his life, that he could manage the narrative to serve his own purposes. Now that control was slipping away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. "You're not that person," Robert said desperately, reaching for her hand again. "You're kind, and intelligent, and gullible." Ashley interrupted, pulling her hand away. "Let's not forget gullible, because that's what I'd have to be to believe anything you say right now." The transformation in Ashley was remarkable. The woman who had spent the evening praising my restaurant and positioning herself as an expert on fine dining had been replaced by someone who was finally seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time in months. "I've been thinking about all the things that didn't add up," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "All the times you couldn't meet me at certain places, all the conversations you cut short when your phone rang, all the weekends you said you were dealing with divorce paperwork but were probably just home with your wife. Each revelation was like watching a puzzle come together, and I found myself genuinely impressed by Ashley's analytical abilities. She was deconstructing Robert's lies with surgical precision, exposing the elaborate web of deception he had woven around both of us. "And the worst part," Ashley said, her voice breaking slightly, "is that I actually liked her. When I was talking to your wife tonight, before I knew who she was, I thought she seemed intelligent and composed. I respected her, and all the while I was the one betraying her." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and I felt something unexpected stir in my chest, not quite sympathy, but something approaching understanding. Ashley had been as much a victim of Robert's manipulation as I had been, just in a different way. Robert's face had gone from red to ashen, and I could see him struggling to find some way to salvage the situation. "Carla and our marriage was already over. You didn't break up anything that wasn't already broken, was it?" Ashley asked, her voice sharp with skepticism. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your marriage was just inconvenient to your plans to have an affair. So you created a narrative that made me feel like I was helping you escape an unhappy situation, when really I was just what? Entertainment. A distraction." The questions were devastating in their accuracy, and I watched Robert's carefully constructed facade finally crumble completely. He had no answers because there were no answers that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. "I loved you," he said quietly, playing his final card. "I still love you." Ashley let out a bitter laugh. "Do you? Because love involves honesty, Robert. It involves respect. It involves not using someone as a pawn in whatever game you're playing with your wife." She adjusted her purse strap, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both finality and dignity. "I'm going to need time to think about who I am when I'm not living in the fantasy you created for me. And I'm going to need to figure out how to make amends for the damage I've caused, even if I didn't know I was causing it." The last statement was directed not at Robert, but toward the restaurant itself, and I felt another unexpected surge of something that might have been respect. Ashley was taking responsibility for her actions, even the ones she had taken unknowingly. "Don't do this," Robert pleaded, his voice cracking. "Don't throw away what we have because of one misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. Ashley's voice rose slightly, causing several nearby diners to glance in their direction. "You lied to me about being separated. You lied about your wife not caring about your marriage. You let me become a regular customer at her restaurant while I was sleeping with you. That's not a misunderstanding, Robert. That's calculated deception." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him one final time. "And you know what the really sad part is? If you had been honest with me from the beginning, if you had told me the truth about your situation, and let me make an informed decision about whether to get involved, I might have respected you. But now I just feel sorry for you." With that, she walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor with the same confidence she had displayed when she arrived, but now serving a completely different purpose. She was leaving, not arriving, and the sound marked the end of something rather than the beginning. Robert sat alone at the table, staring at the untouched seafood tower and expensive wine that had been meant to celebrate his brother's engagement. The irony was perfect. Surrounded by symbols of celebration and new beginnings, he was instead facing the consequences of his own choices, and the end of the double life he had constructed so carefully. I watched him from across the room, this man who had once been the center of my world, now reduced to a figure of pity and shame. The transformation was complete, and I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction at seeing him finally face the reality of what he had done. The silence that followed Ashley's departure was deafening. Robert sat alone at table 12, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a celebration: the untouched seafood tower, the expensive wine growing warm in crystal glasses, the elegant place settings that now seemed to mock the ruins of his carefully constructed double life. I watched from my position near the bar, as he stared at his hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in the 15 years I had known him, Robert looked genuinely lost. The confident, charismatic man who had always seemed to have an answer for everything now appeared to be grappling with questions he couldn't manipulate his way out of. Cooper and Tiara remained at the table, their engagement celebration forgotten in the wake of the evening's revelations. I could see them exchanging worried glances, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. Elise sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of controlled fury that spoke to a mother's disappointment in her eldest son. "Robert," Cooper said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances. "Maybe we should go. This isn't the place to—" "Isn't it?" Robert interrupted, his voice hollow. "This is exactly the place. This is where it all happened, where I brought her, week after week, letting her fall in love with something my wife built, while I told her lies about my marriage being over." The admission was raw, unfiltered by the usual charm and deflection that characterized Robert's communication style. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was being completely honest about his actions and their consequences. "Why?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do such a thing?" To both of them. Robert looked up at his mother, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "I don't know," he said simply. "I honestly don't know." Carla was so focused on this place, so driven, so successful, and I felt like I was becoming irrelevant in her life. The explanation was pathetic in its self-pity, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. "So instead of talking to her about it," Cooper said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "you decided to have an affair, and not just any affair. You brought your mistress to Carla's restaurant and let her become a regular customer, while she had no idea she was supporting the business of the woman you were betraying." When Cooper laid it out so starkly, the psychological cruelty of Robert's actions became even more apparent. This wasn't just adultery, it was an elaborate form of emotional torture that had damaged multiple lives. "I never meant for it to go that far," Robert said weakly. "At first it was just, Ashley mentioned she liked fine dining, and I thought about bringing her here once. Just once, but she loved it so much, and she started coming back on her own, and then it became this whole thing where she thought she had discovered this amazing place." "And you never thought to tell her the truth?" Kiara asked, speaking for the first time since the revelations began. "You never thought that maybe she had a right to know she was giving money to your wife?" Robert's face crumpled. "How could I? Once I let it go on for more than a few visits, there was no way to explain it without admitting that I had been lying to her about everything. About being separated, about Carla not caring about our marriage, about why I couldn't be seen with her in public." The web of lies was staggering in its complexity, and I found myself almost impressed by the mental gymnastics Robert must have performed to keep track of all his deceptions. But impressive or not, the structure had finally collapsed under its own weight. "You know what the worst part is?" Robert continued, his voice breaking. "I actually admired what Carla had built here. I was proud of her success, proud that my wife had created something so beautiful and meaningful. But instead of supporting her, instead of being the partner she deserved, I turned her achievement into a weapon against her." The realization seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and he buried his face in his hands. For the first time, Robert was seeing his actions not through the lens of his own wants and justifications, but through the impact they had had on the people around him. "She built this place while I was lying to another woman about our marriage," he whispered. "Every night she came home exhausted from working 18-hour days to make this dream a reality. I was texting Ashley, maintaining the fiction that Carla didn't care about me anymore. The truth was devastating in its clarity. While I had been pouring my heart and soul into creating Meridian Grille, Robert had been constructing an elaborate deception that painted my dedication as evidence of a failed marriage. He had weaponized my success against me, using it to justify his affair, while simultaneously allowing his mistress to unknowingly support the very business he was claiming had driven us apart. "I think," Elise said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's profound disappointment, "that you need to take a long, hard look at who you've become, Robert. Because the man I raised would never have done something so calculated and cruel." The words hung in the air like a judgment, and I watched as Robert finally began to grasp the full scope of what he had lost. Not just his marriage, not just his relationship with Ashley, but the respect of his own family. The weight of Elise's words seemed to crush what remained of Robert's composure. He sat hunched over the table, his face buried in his hands, while his family processed the full scope of his deception. I found myself drawn back toward table 12, not out of sympathy, but out of a strange fascination with watching someone finally confront the consequences of their own choices. "I need to talk to her," Robert said suddenly, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "I need to explain, to apologize, to make this right somehow." Cooper shook his head firmly. "No, Robert. You need to leave Carla alone. You've done enough damage." "But she's my wife," Robert protested, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "We've been together for 15 years. That has to count for something, does it?" Kiara asked quietly, her voice carrying a maturity that belied her years. "Because from what I've seen tonight, you've spent the last 6 months systematically betraying everything that relationship was supposed to mean." The simple truth of her statement seemed to hit Robert like a physical blow. He had been married to me for 15 years, but for the last 6 months, he had been living a completely different life, one built on lies and deception that had poisoned everything we had built together. "I can make this right," he insisted, his voice growing more frantic. "I can end things with Ashley. I mean, they're already ended, and I can focus on rebuilding my marriage with Carla. I can support her business, be the husband she deserves." The delusion was breathtaking in its scope. Even now, even after everything that had been revealed, Robert was still trying to control the narrative, still believing he could manipulate his way out of the consequences of his actions. "Robert," Elise said, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something to a child, "you brought your mistress to your wife's restaurant for months. You let her become a regular customer, while telling her that your marriage was over. You used Carla's success as justification for your affair. How exactly do you plan to explain that away?" The questions hung in the air, and I could see Robert struggling to find answers that would make his actions seem reasonable or forgivable. But there were no such answers, and we all knew it. "I made mistakes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But people recover from mistakes. Marriages survive affairs. We can get counseling. We can work through this. Can we?" The voice that spoke wasn't Cooper's or Elise's, but mine. I had finally decided to rejoin the conversation, unable to listen to Robert's delusional planning any longer. The entire table turned to look at me as I approached, and I could see the mixture of hope and fear in Robert's eyes. He still believed, somehow, that he could charm his way back into my good graces, that he could convince me to give him another chance. "Carla," he said, starting to stand. "I'm so sorry. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but if we could just talk privately." "Sit down, Robert," I said quietly, and something in my tone made him comply immediately. "We're going to have this conversation right here, in front of your family, because I think they deserve to hear what I have to say." I remained standing, looking down at the man who had once been the center of my world. "You want to know if our marriage can survive this? Let me ask you something. Do you have any idea what the last 6 months have been like for me?" Robert's face was blank, and I realized he genuinely didn't understand what I was asking. "While you were telling Ashley that I was too focused on work to care about our marriage," I continued, "I was working 18-hour days to build something meaningful. I was sacrificing sleep, social time, personal relationships, all to create something that would secure our future. And every night when I came home exhausted, every time I tried to share my excitement about a successful evening, or a positive review, you were already mentally checked out, already invested in someone else." The truth was devastating in its simplicity. While I had been building our future, Robert had been planning his escape from it. I thought you weren't interested in the restaurant, Robert said weakly. You never talked about it at home. I stopped talking about it at home, because every time I did, you changed the subject. I replied, my voice remaining calm but carrying an edge of steel. You made it clear that my work was an inconvenience to you, something that was taking away from the attention you felt you deserved. The accusation hung in the air, and I could see the moment when Robert realized it was true. He had actively discouraged my enthusiasm for the restaurant, had made me feel guilty for pursuing my dreams, all while using my dedication as justification for his affair. So to answer your question, I continued, no, our marriage cannot survive this, not because you had an affair, but because you used my success as a weapon against me. You took the thing I was most proud of, and twisted it into evidence that I was a bad wife. Robert's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like a child who had been caught in a lie too big to explain away. But I can change, he said desperately. I can be better, I can support you the way I should have from the beginning. Can you? I asked, genuinely curious. Because the man I married would never have brought his mistress to his wife's restaurant. The man I married would have celebrated my success, not resented it. So if you've changed that much, if you've become someone capable of this level of deception and cruelty, how can I trust that you can change back? The question hung in the air like a final judgment, and I watched as Robert's face cycled through a range of emotions, desperation, anger, grief, and finally, a kind of hollow acceptance. He had no answer, because we both knew the truth. The man I had married no longer existed, if he ever had at all. I understand, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand that I've lost you. I understand that I've lost everything. The admission was stark in its simplicity, devoid of the usual charm and manipulation that had characterized so much of our relationship. For perhaps the first time in years, Robert was being completely honest with me. Yes, I replied quietly, you have. Cooper reached across the table and placed his hand over Robert's. We should go, he said gently. All of us. This has been enough for one evening. Robert nodded, seeming to age years in the space of moments. As he stood from the table, he looked around the restaurant one final time, taking in the elegant decor, the attentive staff, the carefully curated atmosphere that had become the stage for his downfall. I'm proud of what you've built here, he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that caught me off guard. I should have told you that months ago. I should have supported you instead of resenting you. The apology was too little too late, but I found myself nodding in acknowledgement. Yes, you should have. As the family gathered their belongings, Elise approached me with tears in her eyes. Carla, dear, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I know, I said, taking her hands in mine. This isn't your fault, Elise. You raised him better than this. She squeezed my hands tightly. You'll always be family to me, regardless of what happens with Robert. Cooper and Tiara each gave me warm embraces, their engagement celebration forgotten in the wake of the evening's revelations. We're sorry this happened during your special night, I told them. You deserved better. So did you? Tiara replied simply, and her words carried a weight that seemed to encapsulate everything that had transpired. As the family made their way toward the exit, Robert lingered for a moment, looking as if he wanted to say something more. But what was there left to say? The damage was done, the truth was out, and the consequences were irreversible. Goodbye, Carla, he said finally, and I heard the finality in his voice. This wasn't see you later, or we'll talk soon. This was goodbye. Goodbye, Robert, I replied. And with those words, 15 years of marriage came to an end. After they left, I stood alone in my restaurant, surrounded by the soft hum of evening service continuing around me. Other diners laughed and chatted, unaware that they had just witnessed the quiet conclusion of a marriage and the birth of something new. I walked to the bar and ordered a glass of wine, not the expensive vintage I had selected for table 12, but a simple, elegant Pinot Noir that I had been saving for a special occasion. Tonight felt like exactly the right time. As I sipped the wine, I felt a sense of completeness wash over me. The confrontation was over, the truth was out, and the scales of justice had finally balanced. Robert would face the consequences of his choices, Ashley would rebuild her life with hard-won wisdom, and I would move forward with the clarity that comes from surviving betrayal and emerging stronger. The restaurant continued its evening rhythm around me, and I realized that this was where I belonged. Not as someone's wife, not as half of a couple, but as the creator and guardian of something beautiful and meaningful. I had built Meridian Grille with my own hands, my own vision, my own determination. It was mine in a way that nothing else had ever been. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. The revenge had been served, the justice had been delivered, and the future, whatever it held, was entirely my own to shape. I raised my glass in a silent toast to new beginnings, to hard-won wisdom, and to the satisfaction of a job well done. The evening was perfect after all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.